Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing whether or not the San Jose Sharks should re-sign Patrick Marleau for yet another season. Now, this question has, of course, popped up due to the recent news that Joe Thornton has signed a one-year deal with the Florida Panthers, and so it begs the question, of course, whether or not the second overall from that 1997 draft will also re-up for yet another year. But while Thornton was still relatively productive with the Toronto Maple Leafs this past season, which earned him a new deal with another team, the Florida Panthers, Patrick Marleau didn't really have as much offensive success as Thornton. As we'll take a look at the past 3 years for Patrick Marleau, as we first discussed from a purely statistical point of view, the question of whether or not the Sharks should re-sign Marleau. So let's first start with the 18-19 season. This was his second year on his over $6 million contract with the Toronto Maple Leafs. A pretty crazy deal that they did indeed sign him to for 3 years at his age. And in that second season, he played all 82 games. No surprise there. 16 goals, pretty solid. 21 assists for 37 points. For a point per game total of .45. Certainly not awful points total, but at the end of that season, the Toronto Maple Leafs needed to re-sign some other deals for their top stars, and so they couldn't really make use of this over $6 million contract from Patrick Marleau, so they had to end up getting rid of a first-round picks so they could trade him to the Carolina Hurricanes and buy him out. At the start of the 1920 season, Marleau was actually teamless, but just a few games into the start of the year, the Sharks were losing and decided to bring on Patrick Marleau for a bit of offensive help, and that actually worked out decently well. Patrick Marleau ended up playing 66 games, which is technically the full season, as he ended up missing the first few games, which doesn't actually break his streak of consecutive games played, and this is also taking into account his performance with the Pittsburgh Penguins after the Sharks traded him at the trade deadline of that year. 11 goals, 11 assists for 22 points. It is obviously a decline from the previous year, but you also have to consider the fact that Patrick Marleau at times was playing maybe even a bit too much with players like Matthews and Mitch Marner, and he wasn't given as many good opportunities like that with the Sharks and by extension with the Pittsburgh Penguins that year. So 22 points going down to a .33 points per game pace, not the worst thing in the world, and as such, the Sharks decide to bring him back for another year. Obviously, also cannot discount the fact that this would allow Patrick Marleau to break the all-time games played record, but still, they bring back Patrick Marleau, and it's pretty justified, at least statistically. But that's where we get to sort of an issue here, as in the 2021 season, Patrick Marleau, of course, played all 56 games, and yet only managed to score 4 goals, 5 assists for 9 points on the year, dropping his points per game total by half, going from the .33 of the previous year down to a .16 for this year. And while there were a few moments on the ice where Patrick Marleau had some bad breaks and probably could have had a couple more points here or there, the fact remains is that Patrick Marleau did not really look like an enigmatic forward when he was playing on the ice. Now that brings us to another thing where you could talk about, as it's not necessarily only the offensive game, but is there a defensive style that Patrick Marleau brings to the team? Well, not really. Patrick Marleau has never really been known as a defensive forward, and while maybe he's slightly more trustworthy than younger forwards who also aren't really known for the defensive game, like a player like John Leonard, it's not as though Patrick Marleau is getting some shorthanded ice time or anything of the sort. And so he's not really bringing anything to the table offensively. He's not bringing a ton to the table defensively either. And so is he really worth bringing back? Well, on a 1-year deal at minimum, at minimum money, $750,000, like what Thornton signed with the Florida Panthers, you could definitely argue that a player of Patrick Marleau's caliber could be brought in just to play some games. But that really brings us to our last and final issue here, which is the fact that if Patrick Marleau is indeed re-signed by the San Jose Sharks, he will end up playing all 82 games of the season, barring any sort of injury. Bob Booner is not going to be the coach, or really anyone would be the coach, to bench Patrick Marleau to healthy scratch him in a game. And something that Doug Wilson has talked about so much this offseason is the fact of competition in the lineup. This is exactly what Doug Wilson wants. He brought in a bunch of players, signed a bunch of deals for, players like Bonino, and he brought back Matt Nieto, and he signed up Andrew Cogliano, and there's a ton of younger players for the San Jose Sharks, and especially with the departure or the likely departure of Evander Kane. Technically, they could still start the season with him there, but it's sort of unlikely. There are a lot of open roster spots, right? You look past Meyer, Hurdle, and Couture, and then you look sort of past Barabanov, Balcers, and LeBanc, and then maybe the only other player who has a probably consistent roster spot would be Nick Bonino, and that would leave 5 open spots on the roster for some younger players to compete for. So if you bring in Patrick Marleau to that, suddenly you're only opening with 4 open spots, because Patrick Marleau is always going to be in that bottom 6 because he has, the pedigree of having played the most games in the NHL ever, and of course the fact that he's played over 900 straight NHL games as well. So if you bring in Patrick Marleau, he will indeed play all 82 games. And so, normally you might look at, oh, look, he's probably a better option than Jeff Viel, and the Sharks re-signed Jeff Viel, but Viel can only, can justifiably be played 15, 20 games in a particular year. Patrick Marleau, not so much. And so it comes up to a situation where if the Sharks were, let's say, a very competitive team, they were expected to make the playoffs and were hoping to compete for a Stanley Cup, then sure, bringing in Patrick Marleau, playing him 10 minutes a night on the 4th line, all 82 games of the season, really wouldn't be the end of the world. But the fact is that the Sharks are in sort of a transitionary period. Even though Doug Wilson has made some signings to try and get this team back to the playoffs, it is pretty clear that the Sharks are going to be trying, or at least should be trying, to integrate a lot more younger talent into the roster, and that should start this season. It's very likely that in 3 or 4 years' time, the Sharks roster as we know it will look significantly different, with many, many different and new faces than it is going to look in this upcoming season. The Sharks have gone from having one of the worst prospect pools in the entire league to being in the upper half by all accounts, pretty much. Some people even say the Sharks are top 10 in terms of prospect pool, and I've even seen people say that the Sharks are up there in the top 5 for prospect talent, just based off of the past couple of drafts and some trades that the Sharks have made. So right now, the Sharks, they need to be integrating young talent into this roster, and Patrick Marleau, as much as I like him as a player, and I'd love to see him play another season in teal, it is a business, and the Sharks need to get some younger talent integrated into their roster, because that's really going to be the future of the San Jose Sharks over these next few years, and I just don't think Patrick Marleau really fits into the picture. Class dismissed.